Manhattan. The night Bellamy Grand Hotels announced its billion-dollar rescue deal, live cameras, red carpet, the whole room watching. Saskia raised her left hand. A blue diamond blazed under the studio lights. Rhett gave me what no Bellamy wife was ever allowed to wear. Her smile didn't waver once. 2 floors above the ballroom, Mara, 8 months pregnant, set down her pen. Her face didn't break. She picked up her phone and said 4 words that stopped everything. Freeze every dollar. The collateral was stolen by the man asking us to save his company. This is the story of what happens when you betray the woman who already built the trap. Stay with me, you won't see this ending coming. The Bellamy Grand Manhattan had been built in 1927 to make a point. 40-foot ceilings, gold leaf pressed into every cornice, chandeliers so heavy the engineers had needed to reinforce the structure above them. The original architect had written in his private notes that guests should walk through the lobby and feel, without being told, that wealth had been gathering here long enough to become part of the walls. Nearly a century later, it still worked. Tonight, every light in the ballroom was burning. Camera crews had been setting up since noon. A red carpet walkway stretched from the lobby entrance to the main event floor, flanked by ivory and deep navy floral arrangements that had cost the public relations budget more than anyone wanted to put in writing. Reporters adjusted their earpieces and checked their reflections in champagne glasses. Publicists moved through the room in quiet, efficient clusters, watching the clock. The evening had one purpose. Bellamy Grand Hotels was announcing a $1.6 billion restructuring agreement. The deal would pull the company out of a debt situation it had been drowning in for 3 years. The funds were finalized. The terms were signed. Authorization was scheduled before midnight. What no camera was going to document was how close the company had come to total collapse. The restructuring had required 18 months of negotiation, hundreds of legal revisions, and a preservation covenant whose language alone had taken nearly 4 months to get every party to accept. Rhett Bellamy had not written a word of it. He had attended a handful of meetings, signed wherever his assistant placed a flag, and trusted that someone on his payroll had handled the details. He was confident that was enough. He stood now at the base of the grand staircase in a suit that fit the way only custom tailoring does, looking exactly like a man who had personally rescued his family's legacy through vision and determination. His smile was camera-ready. His answers were practiced. He had already done 2 interviews, and both had gone exactly the way he wanted. "Rhett, what does tonight mean for Bellamy Grand?" a reporter asked. "It means this name stays above that door for another 100 years, he said. The reporter nodded. Rhett adjusted his cufflinks. 2 floors above the ballroom, in a conference room with a folding table and overhead lights that buzzed faintly when the building's HVAC kicked on, Mara Bellamy was reviewing her 4th set of documentation binders for the evening. She was 8 months pregnant. The chair had no lumbar support. The room smelled like dry erase markers and old carpet. She had been in this building since 9 in the morning. She had not complained about any of it, and she did not intend to. Mara was the independent preservation trustee named in Dorothea Bellamy's estate. Her responsibility was to verify that every historic asset held inside the preservation trust remained properly documented, protected, and unaltered. The restructuring agreement had made that responsibility larger. Several of the trust's assets were now listed as collateral securing the entire $1.6 billion. If anything was wrong with the collateral, the deal stopped. That was why she was still up here at 7 in the evening, while her husband was downstairs accepting credit for an agreement she had spent most of her pregnancy constructing. 3 auditors worked with her at the table. Gregor was the most senior, methodical, 20 years in preservation work, someone who double-checked everything and never apologized for it. Vera handled digital documentation. Tomas managed photography. "Secondary vault records are complete," Gregor said, sliding a folder toward her. "The primary vault is the last item." 20 more minutes, Mara said without looking up. "Then we go down." On a wall-mounted monitor to her left, the hotel's event feed was running low. One of the financial networks had sent a crew and was broadcasting live from the ballroom. She had it on as background noise, not watching, just aware. The ambient sounds drifted in. Applause, a brief music break, laughter from somewhere near the lobby bar. She turned a page and kept reading. By his 3rd interview, Rhett had moved to a position near the hotel's original stone archway, where the camera backdrop looked the most impressive. He was mid-sentence about generational stewardship when Saskia Vane crossed into the frame from his right. He had not told his PR team she was coming. He had told himself it was her decision to appear. But her name was on the guest list as a personal guest, and no one in security had been told to stop her. Those were Rhett's decisions, even if he had made them quietly. Saskia moved through the room without rushing and without apologizing for being looked at. She wore a dress the color of deep ocean water, and had the specific posture of someone who understood that cameras were always a possibility. She was a luxury image consultant by profession. Her actual work was helping wealthy clients control how they appeared to the world, and she was extraordinarily good at it. She stepped into the frame beside Rhett and stood there like she belonged in it. The reporter's eyes moved between them. A quick professional reassessment. "Who are you joining us with tonight?" the reporter asked. "Saskia Vane," she said. "I'm a consultant, and tonight I'm here as Rhett's guest." She raised her left hand just slightly. It was a natural-looking gesture if you didn't know it had been rehearsed. The ring caught the light immediately. It was enormous, a blue diamond set in platinum, surrounded by smaller white stones arranged in a widening arc. The blue was saturated and cool, the color of something pulled from great depth. Every camera in a 10-foot radius responded to it. "That's remarkable," the reporter said, leaning slightly forward. "Can you tell us about it?" Saskia turned her hand toward the lens. "Rhett gave it to me," she said. "He wanted to give me something that truly meant something. Something no Bellamy bride had ever been allowed to wear." The reporter paused. "Is that the Bellamy Azure?" She had covered luxury hospitality for 11 years. The Bellamy Azure appeared in almost every piece of long-form coverage about the family's history. A 96-carat blue diamond acquired in the 1930s. One of the largest privately held blue diamonds in the country. The family had always positioned it as untouchable, too historically significant to wear, too important to move. Saskia smiled. "It is," she said. Rhett removed it from the family collection. He wanted the world to see who he had truly chosen. Rhett kept his face steady. He had learned a long time ago to hold an expression under pressure, but he had not expected her to say the name on camera. The monitor in the conference room was still running. Mara heard the reporter say Bellamy Azure. She looked up. She watched the last 30 seconds of the exchange. She watched Saskia turn her hand toward the camera. She watched the reporter's face process the information. She watched Rhett standing there, jaw set, not correcting a single word. She set down her pen. She sat for a moment, not panicking, not frozen, just absorbing exactly what she had seen and what it meant. Then she stood. "Gregor," she said, "we're going to the vault now." He looked at her expression and didn't ask questions. "Ready when you are," he said. The vault was in the oldest section of the building, 2 floors below the lobby. The service corridor leading to it had stone walls and exposed ceiling pipes, and the air there was cooler and still. The vault door was original brass heavy combination dial, worn smooth from decades of use. The family had always believed older security was harder to compromise remotely. The Preservation Trust had updated the monitoring systems around it without touching the door itself. Mara was the authorized trustee. The auditors were the designated witnesses. The access was logged. The door opened correctly. The display case inside held a blue diamond. Mara stepped forward and looked at it. She moved slightly to change the angle of the light. She asked Gregor for the certification folder and compared the documentation in front of her to what was sitting in the case. She had inspected the real Bellamy Azure twice during her tenure. She remembered it with the precision of someone whose job required remembering things precisely. The depth of color, the slight internal asymmetry near the base, present in every authentication record since the diamond was first certified. The insurance file included a 3-dimensional scan of that asymmetry. It was unique. It could not be reproduced. The stone in this case sat too evenly under the light. Its color was uniform in a way natural diamonds never quite managed. It caught every angle cleanly, consistently, with none of the internal variation that accumulated over millions of years underground. It was an excellent copy, expensive probably. It was not the Bellamy Azure. "Document everything," Mara said. Her voice did not waver. "The display case, the certification labels, the combination access log, the temperature record. I want photographs of every surface in this room." Gregor and Vera moved immediately. Mara stepped back and opened her phone. Elias Wren was the independent counsel representing the employee trust on the other side of the restructuring agreement. He had no loyalty to the Bellamy family, no incentive to protect them from anything, and a professional reputation built entirely on doing exactly what the documents required. He picked up on the second ring. "Mara," he said, "authorization window opens in about 40 minutes. "There is no authorization tonight," she said. "Silence. Tell me." "The Bellamy Azure has been removed from the preservation vault and replaced with a replica," she said. "The original stone is currently being worn on live television by Rhett's mistress." She confirmed the diamond's identity by name on the record on a network broadcast. Elias was quiet for a long moment. "You have witnesses with you right now. 3 certified auditors. The vault was opened in their presence. Full documentation is being captured as we speak." "Mara." His voice was careful. "Do you understand what this triggers?" "Yes," she said. "I wrote the provision." She heard him exhale. "The lenders are expecting Elias." She spoke quietly and without any hurry. "Freeze every dollar. The collateral was stolen by the man asking us to save his company." A pause. "I'll make the call," he said. She ended the call and looked at the replica diamond sitting undisturbed in its case, looking exactly like something that had always been there. Rhett had taken the real one out of this vault, handed it to another woman, and watched her go on television to announce it to the world. He had arranged it to land on this specific night, the night designed to celebrate an agreement Mara had spent most of her pregnancy building, clause by clause, because she understood that the only way to protect the employees, the assets, and the company's future was to build safeguards strong enough that no single person could dismantle them through arrogance or carelessness. He had not read those safeguards. He had assumed that someone else would worry about the details. And so the provision she had written to protect the company from exactly this kind of decision was now active, was documented, and had 3 witnesses standing in the same room. Mara put her phone in her pocket. "Make sure the timestamps are accurate on all of this," she told Gregor. "Everything preserved in original format, nothing summarized." "Understood," he said. She walked back toward the elevator. Downstairs, the broadcast was still running. Rhett was probably still standing near his archway. Saskia's ring was probably still catching the light. Neither of them knew yet what had happened in this room. They would. By 7 the next morning, Rhett's public relations director had already drafted 4 different statements. He rejected the first 3. The first was too apologetic. It suggested the company was investigating an irregularity, which implied there was something to investigate. The second was too vague. Rhett said it sounded like a man who knew he was guilty. The third tried to explain the Bellamy Azure's legal status, which was the last thing Rhett wanted anyone reading carefully. He approved the fourth. It was clean, confident, and completely false. The statement said that the ring Saskia Vane wore during last night's broadcast contained a ceremonial replica of the Bellamy Azure, a copy that had been created years ago for promotional purposes. It said the original stone remained safely secured in the hotel's preservation vault, as required by the family's historic preservation standards. It thanked the media for their interest in the Bellamy legacy and directed further questions to the Public Relations Office. The statement went out at 7:42. By 8, 3 luxury industry journalists had already called for comment. 2 historians who had written about the Bellamy diamond reached out to the hotel's archive department asking for clarification. One appraiser who had worked with blue diamonds for 30 years posted publicly that the stone in last night's broadcast did not look like a promotional replica to him. Rhett ignored all of it. He had a different calculation running. Mara was 8 months pregnant. She was married to him. The company she had spent 18 months working to protect employed thousands of people who would lose their jobs if the restructuring fell apart. He was certain, the way certain men are certain about certain things, that she would make the practical choice. She would stay quiet. She would let the statement hold. She would protect the deal because the deal was worth protecting, and she was smart enough to know that. He sent her a message at 8:15. It said, "I need you to confirm the vault inspection found everything in order. Just say it was routine." She did not respond. Mara was at her attorney's office by 9. Not the family's attorney, her own, a woman named Constance, who had represented her professionally for 6 years and had no relationship with the Bellamy family beyond what Mara had brought into it. She had already forwarded the vault documentation to Elias Wren. She had already confirmed with Gregor that his audit records were preserved in a format that would hold up under legal scrutiny. She had already reviewed the relevant section of the restructuring agreement twice, though she had written it herself and did not particularly need to. She was not running from anything. She was preparing. At 10:30, she called Rhett. She asked him to meet her privately at the hotel, not in his office, not in a conference room where his staff would be present. She specified the property manager's suite on the 3rd floor, which was quiet and had no cameras in the corridor leading to it. He agreed. His tone was already explanatory, which meant he had been rehearsing. He arrived 12 minutes late. She was seated at the table when he walked in. No laptop, no folders spread open, nothing designed to signal she was ready for a fight. She looked like someone who had gotten enough sleep and eaten breakfast, which she had. She was calm in a way that was clearly not performance. Rhett sat across from her. "I know what you're thinking," he started. "I doubt that," she said. "But go ahead," he explained the statement. He explained that the replica story was manageable, that the press would accept it, that no one outside the authentication community would look closely enough to challenge it, that the auditor's findings didn't need to become public record if both of them agreed. The inspection had turned up nothing unusual. He spoke for almost 4 minutes without stopping. When he finished, Mara gave him a moment to make sure he was done. "I'm giving you one chance," she said. "Return the diamond. Disclose what happened to the independent trustees. Let the process work the way it was designed to work." He stared at her. "Mara, that's the offer. One chance. After this conversation, I'm not making it again." Something shifted in his expression, not guilt, not regret. Calculation. He was deciding how much pressure to apply and in which direction. "That diamond belongs to my family," he said. "It has belonged to this family for nearly 100 years. No contract changes that. No agreement drafted by accountants and lawyers tells me what I'm allowed to do with my own inheritance." She looked at him for a moment. Then she opened the folder she'd brought and placed it on the table in front of him. It was the Preservation Covenant, the specific section of the restructuring agreement covering the Bellamy Azure. The relevant paragraphs were marked. The language was clear. It had been reviewed and signed off by every party, including Rhett's own legal team, before the agreement was finalized. "The Bellamy Azure legally belongs to the Preservation Trust," she said. "Not to you. Not to any individual member of this family. Removing it from the vault constitutes theft of secured trust property. Altering it triggers the automatic transfer of the Bellamy family's controlling voting rights." He read the page, or he appeared to. His eyes moved across it with the attention of someone looking for a way out, rather than trying to understand what was in front of him. "This is a technicality," he said. "It's a binding legal provision. It's language someone buried in 200 pages of documentation specifically to create a trap." He pushed the folder back toward her. "You wrote this covenant. You know exactly what you put in it and why." "I wrote it to protect the assets that secure this agreement," she said. "That's the role I was given. You wrote it to protect yourself." His voice sharpened. "This is about Saskia. This is about what you saw on that broadcast and what you want to do to me because of it." She didn't answer that. There was no productive version of that argument, and she had known going in that he would try to get there eventually. "The offer stands until I leave this room," she said. He stood up. "I'm not destroying my company over a clause you invented to punish me for leaving you," he said. "You want to fight this? Then fight it. But everyone is going to know what you're doing and why you're doing it." He left. She sat at the table for another few minutes. She closed the folder. Then she picked up her phone and sent a brief message to Elias. It said, "He refused. Proceed with the formal documentation." Saskia learned what the covenant actually said around noon. She had been in Rhett's penthouse apartment since early morning, managing messages from her own publicist and monitoring the coverage online. She had read the statement he released and thought it was adequate. She had told herself the ceremonial replica story was believable enough. She had watched the morning coverage and decided the appraisers and historians raising questions were too niche to matter. Then one of her contacts in the financial press sent her a forwarded summary of the restructuring agreement's preservation clause. She read it 3 times. She called Rhett. "I need the ring back," she said the moment he answered. "Saskia, I need you to take it back right now. Tonight. We say it was a misunderstanding. I thought it was the replica. I didn't know what I was confirming on camera. We get ahead of it." He was quiet for a moment. "We can't return it," he said. "Why not? The vault is still there. Just put it back before anyone does an independent inspection," he told her. The original stone had been cut down. The jeweler had reshaped it to fit the mounting Rhett had commissioned. The Bellamy Azure was no longer the same stone it had been when it was removed from the vault. Returning it, even placing it back in the case, would only confirm that someone had altered a protected asset. There was no version of returning the stone that didn't prove the violation. Saskia sat with that for a long moment. "Then we need to make this go away," she said. "Whatever records exist of how we got the stone, the cutter, the transport, anything, we need those gone." Rhett had already been thinking about that. He found the cutter's private number in his phone and called from a line that was not his primary device. The cutter was a small independent jeweler in Connecticut who had worked with high-end private clients for 20 years. He was discreet, skilled, and understood that the people who hired him were not always looking for documentation of their transactions. He had not asked where the blue diamond came from. Rhett had not told him. Rhett told him to destroy every record of the work, the intake photographs, the measurement logs, the payment records, any communication between them on any platform. The cutter said he understood. What he did not say, because he had not yet decided what to say, was that 2 days before this call, a man from the hotel's internal security office had visited his shop in person and left a business card. The man had been polite. He had not asked questions or made demands. He had simply said the hotel was reviewing some historical documentation and that if the cutter had any questions about his rights and protections, there were people he should speak to. The cutter had kept the card. He kept it after Rhett's call too. Saskia called her assistant twice within an hour. Her assistant, a 24-year-old named Pilar who had worked for her for 14 months, managed Saskia's personal calendar, her social media drafts, and her private correspondence files. She also had access to Saskia's cloud backup, which synced automatically and constantly. Saskia told her to find and delete every video file from the previous 3 weeks that showed Rhett presenting the ring to her. There were at least 2 she knew of, one recorded on Pilar's own phone during the private showing at Rhett's apartment, and one from a dinner the week before the broadcast, where Rhett had brought out the ring a second time to show a friend. Saskia's own phone had automatically backed those files up somewhere she couldn't easily reach herself. Pilar said she would take care of it. She did not delete the files. She had a cousin who worked in labor law. Her cousin had told her once very clearly that deleting files when someone above you was under legal investigation was not a career problem. It was a criminal problem. Pilar had not entirely understood that conversation when she first heard it. She understood it now. She moved the files to a separate encrypted folder, noted the timestamp, and sent a message to her personal email documenting what she had been asked to do and when. Mara did not call anyone at the hotel security office. She did not contact Pilar. She did not reach out to the cutter in Connecticut. She had enough experience in preservation law to know that the worst thing she could do at this moment was act on her own authority. If she placed any pressure on witnesses or accessed communications through her trustee role, Rhett would argue later that she had abused her position. He would reframe the entire story as a wife using institutional power to destroy her estranged husband. She was not going to give him that argument. She made one call to the hotel's internal security director and told him she had reason to believe evidence relevant to the vault investigation might be at risk. She asked him to take every precaution available to him under his department's own protocols. She did not tell him what to look for or where to look. The security director had worked at Bellamy Grand for 17 years. He had managed fraud investigations, personnel disputes, and one situation involving a visiting government official she was still not permitted to discuss. He knew what every precaution available meant come from someone in Mara's position. He thanked her and ended the call. By that evening, his team had preserved the communication logs between Rhett and the cutter. They had cross-referenced the vault access records with the building's elevator logs and found an entry that matched the cutter's registered vehicle in the building's overnight parking. They had also flagged a series of deleted messages between Saskia's office number and an unregistered account that had attempted to access the hotel's internal cloud archive. None of this reached Mara's desk. It reached the security director's. He kept it there, preserved it correctly, and waited. Late that night, Saskia was sitting in the apartment with the ring on the dressing table in front of her. She had taken it off an hour earlier and hadn't put it back on. She had spent some time earlier trying to research whether another blue diamond of similar size and color could be sourced and placed in the vault before an independent inspection was ordered. It was a long-shot idea, but she was looking for any version of this situation that ended with her not losing everything she had built. Then she found the insurance documentation. The Bellamy Azure had been formally appraised and scanned in 2019. The insurance record included a complete three-dimensional rendering of the diamond's internal structure, the crystalline inclusions, the unique asymmetry near its base, every microscopic characteristic that made it, under proper authentication, impossible to substitute. The scan was on file with the insurance company, with 2 independent authentication firms, and with the Preservation Trust. There was no replacement, not a real one. Any blue diamond placed in that vault would fail authentication against the scan on file within minutes of serious examination. Saskia put the ring in her jewelry case and closed the lid. The stone she had worn on live television as proof of her position, as proof that she had won, was already identified, already documented, already recorded in a file she had not known existed, that she could not reach, that Rhett clearly had never thought to check. She did not sleep well. The divorce filing came first. Rhett's attorney submitted it on a Tuesday morning, and by noon it had been picked up by 2 entertainment news outlets and a business wire. The filing itself was standard irreconcilable differences, separation of assets, custody to be determined. Nothing in the document explained why a man would file for divorce 8 days after his pregnant wife froze a $1 billion restructuring agreement. The press conference explained it. Rhett held it in the hotel's smaller media room, not the grand ballroom. A deliberate choice. The smaller room looked less like a corporate announcement and more like a man making a personal statement. His communications director had suggested it, and Rhett had agreed immediately. He stood at the podium without notes. He spoke about his marriage the way a man speaks about something he has already processed and moved past, measured, slightly sorrowful. No visible anger, because anger would have looked defensive. He described a relationship that had grown cold over years, a wife who had accepted a position of institutional power within his family's company and then used it, at the most critical moment in the company's history, to settle a personal score. "I am not here to attack Mara," he said, "but I am here to tell the truth. She discovered my relationship with Saskia, and within 48 hours she froze a restructuring agreement that 10,000 employees are depending on. She has placed her personal pain above the livelihoods of people who never did anything to her." He paused. "I understand why she's hurting, I do. But holding an entire workforce hostage over a private betrayal is not something I can defend, and it's not something I'm willing to stay silent about. The room had 11 reporters. 8 of them wrote it down. The Bellamy family released their own statement the following morning. It was carefully coordinated with Rhett's and landed in the same news cycle. It described Mara as a talented attorney who had been granted extraordinary authority through Dorothea Bellamy's estate authority that was never intended to give an in-law unilateral control over the company's future. It said the family had the deepest respect for Mara's legal expertise, but believed her current actions reflected a conflict of interest that no fiduciary should be permitted to maintain. The phrase they kept repeating was outsider with insider authority. It was effective. 3 business journalists picked it up without attribution and used it in their own analysis pieces. Rhett's uncle spoke separately to a financial news channel. He said Dorothea Bellamy had trusted Mara because Dorothea had believed the marriage was permanent. He implied, without saying directly, that a woman who was now being divorced should not retain the institutional power her marriage had provided her. None of them mentioned the diamond. They did not have to. The public story was already reshaping. A jealous wife, a cold marriage, a billion-dollar deal held hostage by a woman who couldn't separate her professional responsibilities from her personal grief. It was a clean narrative, simple, repeatable, and it was working. The petition to remove Mara as independent preservation trustee was filed with the restructuring board on Thursday. Rhett's legal team argued that the marital conflict between Mara and Rhett created an unavoidable appearance of bias. They argued that no trustee could be expected to exercise neutral judgment while simultaneously divorcing the man whose decision she was tasked with evaluating. They asked the board to suspend her voting authority temporarily, pending an outside committee review. The board met for 3 hours. They did not rule in Rhett's favor, but they did not rule against him either. They issued a temporary suspension of Mara's active authority while a committee of 3 independent members conducted a conflict of interest review. The suspension would remain in effect until the review concluded. It was, on paper, a procedural measure, a standard precaution. The board was not accusing Mara of anything. In practice, it removed her from the one position where her authority actually mattered. Elias Wren called her the same afternoon. "I want you to understand what this means operationally," he said. "I understand it," she said. "Your access to the trust's active decisions is suspended. You can't issue any orders, authorize any reviews, or direct any investigations through the trustee office while the committee is working." "I know, Elias." A pause. "How are you doing?" he asked. She considered the question. "I'm fine," she said. "Let the committee work." She did not tell him she was 34 weeks pregnant, that she had not slept more than 5 hours in 4 days, or that she had spent the previous evening reading through every legal precedent she could find on trustee conflict of interest reviews, to understand exactly what the committee would be looking for and how long it was likely to take. She had done all of that. She simply did not need to say it. Rhett moved quickly once the suspension was confirmed. He contacted 2 members of the hotel security team directly, not through official channels, not through the security director. He reached them through a personal assistant who passed messages informally. He did not put anything in writing that he could control. He asked the security personnel to review the vault access logs from the weeks surrounding the television broadcast and flag anything that might reflect clerical inconsistency. Clerical inconsistency was the phrase he used. Both security team members understood what he was actually asking. One of them said he would look into it. The other said he needed more clarity on what he was being asked to do before he could commit to anything. Rhett interpreted that as manageable friction. He had handled personnel resistance before. What he did not know was that the hotel's internal security director had already placed a standing instruction quietly, verbally, with 2 witnesses that any external contact requesting alterations or reviews of vault access documentation should be logged immediately and reported to the independent committee, not to Rhett, not to anyone in Rhett's office. The contact attempt was logged within 24 hours. The security director did not tell Mara. He did not have to. His report went to the committee, which was exactly where it needed to go. The independent committee sent Mara a formal document request on Friday. They wanted her private correspondence from the 18 months of contract negotiations, her legal strategy files, her financial records related to her role as trustee, all personal communications between herself and any member of the restructuring board, the lender group, or Rhett's legal team. It was an extensive request. Her attorney, Constance, called it aggressive. "They're looking for anything that suggests you drafted the preservation covenant with the intent to use it against your husband," Constance said. "If they find even one message where you reference Rhett's relationship with Saskia in the context of the covenant, they can argue the clause was designed as a personal weapon." "There aren't any such messages," Mara said. "I know. But producing every record gives Rhett's team access to your full legal strategy. That's a significant exposure. Mara was quiet for a moment. I'm going to produce everything they asked for, she said. Constance paused. Every file, every draft, every communication thread. If I resist the document request, the committee delays. The delay benefits Rhett. The employees continue to wait. She shifted in her chair. The review needs to be fast and it needs to be clean. The only way that happens is if I give them everything they want and make it easy for them to find the truth. Constance spent a few seconds not responding. You understand you're betting your professional reputation on those records being exactly as clean as you believe them to be. Yes, Mara said. I am. She began organizing the files that afternoon. 18 months of documentation. Drafts with revision histories that showed every change made to the covenant language, and the reasoning recorded in margin notes. Correspondence with every party to the agreement, formal, professional, never personal. Financial records showing that her trustee compensation had been fixed at contract initiation and never adjusted. Nothing in the files mentioned Saskia. Nothing in the files mentioned her marriage. The covenant was what it appeared to be a legal mechanism designed to protect an irreplaceable asset from exactly the situation that had now occurred. She had written it because Dorothea Bellamy had asked her to write something strong enough to survive any future CEO, regardless of who that CEO turned out to be. Dorothea had not said Rhett's name. She hadn't needed to. Mara submitted the full production to the committee by end of day Saturday. Saskia had been thinking about the problem for 3 days before she called Rhett with a solution. She had run through every other option first. There was no version of returning the original stone that helped either of them. There was no legal argument that would neutralize the preservation covenant as long as the original diamond remained in her possession. The appraisers who had publicly questioned the ceremonial replica story were not going away. But the committee review had bought them time. With Mara suspended from her trustee role, there was a window, not a large one, but real, before any official independent inspection of the vault could be authorized. The committee's process had a timeline. Reviews of this type typically ran 4 to 6 weeks. In that window, if the vault contained the right stone when the official inspection finally happened, the question of what had been there before became considerably harder to prove. Saskia had spent those 3 days researching blue diamonds. She found what she was looking for through a private dealer network she had used for clients before. A blue diamond in the right size range, unregistered, currently held abroad. Not a match for the Bellamy Azure under detailed authentication, but close enough to require serious time to disprove, and time was exactly what she needed. She told Rhett the plan. Sell the recut Bellamy Azure privately, overseas, before anyone could issue a seizure order. Use the proceeds to acquire the substitute stone. Have the substitute placed in the vault before the committee's review concluded and the official inspection was authorized. The original stone would be untraceable once it crossed borders. Rhett listened to the full plan before responding. He understood that what she was describing was no longer a question of removing an asset that technically belonged to a trust. She was describing an international sale of stolen trust property, the deliberate placement of fraudulent collateral into a secured agreement, and the destruction of evidence in an ongoing investigation. He agreed. He agreed partly because the plan had a real chance of working if it moved fast. He agreed partly because Saskia had already identified the buyer and the flight window, which meant the framework was operational rather than theoretical. He also agreed because a private international sale would generate cash outside the company's accounts. If the restructuring collapsed despite everything, he would have personal liquidity that no court order tied to Bellamy Grand's assets could reach. He had started thinking about that exit more seriously in the last 48 hours, just as a contingency, just in case. Mara learned about the flight through the committee. She did not learn through her own authority, which she did not have. She did not learn through the security director, who was reporting to the committee and not to her. She learned because the committee's process required them to notify her, as the suspended trustee, of any preservation order they were considering issuing. Their notification was brief. They had received evidence of a potential attempt to transport trust property across international borders. They were evaluating whether to issue an emergency preservation order. They wanted to inform her that such an order, if issued, would fall under the committee's authority and not hers. She wrote back one sentence: "Please act on whatever the evidence requires." Then she put her phone down and did not pick it up again for an hour. She sat in Constance's office. Outside the window, the afternoon light was doing what late autumn light does in New York, coming in at a low angle, making everything look slightly more serious than it already was. She had been 8 months pregnant when this started. She was now past 35 weeks. Her daughter would be born into a situation that was still unresolved, into a family that was being publicly torn apart. with a father whose name was now attached to words like fraud and conspiracy in ways that would be searchable for as long as the internet existed. None of that was something she could fix by acting too quickly. Constance brought her coffee she didn't drink and didn't comment on the silence. After a while, Mara said, "Tell me where the review stands." "They received your full document production this morning," Constance said. "If they're moving fast, preliminary findings in 10 to 14 days. "They'll move fast," Mara said. She picked up her phone and looked at the committee's message again. Then she set it face down on the desk. She was not going to call anyone. She was not going to direct anyone. The committee had what it needed. The security director had what he needed. Elias had the preservation clause. The auditors had the vault documentation. Gregor's records were time-stamped, independently maintained, and already submitted. Every piece she had placed carefully over 18 months of work was where it needed to be. What Rhett had never understood, what he had dismissed as a technicality, what the Bellamy family had called outsider interference, was that this was how protection actually worked. It was not dramatic. It was not a confrontation in a hallway or a threat delivered in a penthouse. It was documentation. It was process. It was building something strong enough to hold even when the person most threatened by it tried everything to tear it down. Saskia arrived at Teterboro just after 9 that evening. She had driven herself, no assistant. One carry-on bag and a larger case she had packed that afternoon with clothes she would not actually need at her stated destination. The diamond was inside the larger case in a velvet pouch, inside a cosmetics bag, inside a folded sweater. She had told herself, walking through the terminal, that once she was airborne the worst of it was behind her. The buyer was confirmed. The substitute stone was already in transit from the private dealer. Rhett had the cash arrangements in place. In 72 hours, the vault would contain a replacement. The paper trail would be overseas, and the committee would be reviewing a situation that no longer existed in the form they thought it did. She moved through the private terminal with her luggage. The attendant at the desk looked up and began typing. There were 3 people standing near the far wall she had not noticed when she walked in. They were not airport staff. They were not flight crew. One of them was holding credentials. Saskia stopped walking. She did not run. She was not the kind of person who ran. She stood very still in the middle of the terminal and watched the man with the credentials walk toward her. And she understood, in that specific and awful way that reality sometimes arrives, that the flight she had been certain was her exit was not going to happen. The diamond was still in her bag. She had not yet made it anywhere. The emergency hearing was held in a conference room on the 14th floor of a midtown law firm with no connection to the Bellamy family. Neutral ground. 6 people at the table, the 3 independent committee members, Elias Wren, a senior investigator from the Preservation Board's legal unit, and a court-appointed recorder. Mara was not in the room. Her suspension was still technically in effect, and the committee had made a deliberate decision to keep her out. They understood what Rhett was doing, the narrative about a resentful wife abusing institutional authority, and they were not going to hand him any part of it. If Mara were present at the hearing, every finding that came out of it could be challenged on the grounds that she had influenced it. So she waited 2 floors down in a small office with a window that looked out onto a building under construction. Constance sat with her. They did not talk much. Upstairs, Saskia was already seated when Rhett arrived. She looked at him once and then looked away. He read that correctly. Whatever alliance had existed between them 3 days ago was gone. At Teterboro, when the investigator stopped her and escorted her back through the terminal, she had called Rhett from the car. He had let the call go to voicemail. She had called 3 more times before his assistant picked up and told her he was unavailable. She had a very clear picture of where she stood. The hearing opened with the committee's lead member, a former appellate judge named Hargrove, laying out the process. This was not a criminal proceeding. It was an evidentiary hearing before the independent committee, whose job was to determine whether the preservation covenant had been violated, and if so, what remedies the agreement required. Criminal referrals were a separate matter and were not being decided today. Hargrove asked Saskia to describe, in her own words, how she came to be wearing the Bellamy azure on the night of the broadcast. Saskia had prepared her statement. She delivered it steadily. She said Rhett had presented the ring to her as a personal gift. He had told her the diamond was a family heirloom, that he owned outright part of an inheritance transferred to him privately through his grandmother's estate. She said she had no independent knowledge of the preservation trust, no legal background, and no reason to question Rhett's description of his own property. She had accepted the ring in good faith. She had worn it in good faith. When the reporter asked whether the stone was the Bellamy azure, she had confirmed it because Rhett himself had told her that was the stone's name. She said she was deeply sorry for any harm her actions had caused. Her attorney sat beside her, silent, watching the committee. Hargrove thanked her. Then he asked one of the junior investigators to open the hearing's first exhibit. The room's display screen showed a recording. It was the live television broadcast, specifically the section where Saskia confirmed the diamond's identity. In the recording, Saskia described the Bellamy azure as the untouchable symbol of the family dynasty before saying Rhett had removed it because he wanted the world to know whom he had truly chosen. Hargrove looked at Saskia. "You described the stone as untouchable before confirming what it was," he said. "Where did that language come from?" Saskia's attorney put a hand on the table near her arm. "From conversations with Rhett," she said. "He described it that way." The next exhibit was a series of messages pulled from Saskia's cloud backup, which had been preserved before the deletion attempts were made. The messages were between Saskia and Rhett, dated 7 weeks before the broadcast. In them, Saskia had raised the idea of the ring first. She had written, "If you really want to make a statement, it has to be the azure. Everyone knows what it means. Every Bellamy woman has been told she can't touch it. That's exactly why it has to be mine." Rhett had responded, "It's complicated. There are trust documents." Saskia had written back, "You're the CEO. Figure it out." The room was quiet after the investigator finished reading them. Saskia looked at her attorney. Then she did what she had privately decided to do approximately 4 hours before the hearing started. She turned on Rhett. She said he had controlled every element of the plan from the beginning. He had contacted the jeweler. He had arranged the transport. He had given the security director the order to place a replica in the vault. She said she had raised an idea, one impulsive message in a long conversation, and he had turned it into an operation without fully telling her what he was doing. She said she had been emotionally dependent on him, that he had made her feel that going along with his decisions was the only way to hold on to what they had, and that she was too deep in the relationship to see clearly until it was already too late. Her attorney placed a single document on the table in front of her. She slid it toward Hargrove. It was a formal immunity request. Hargrove set it aside without reading it. He looked at Rhett. Rhett's attorney began speaking before anyone asked him a question. He said the messages showed an impulsive suggestion from a woman trying to impress a man, not an operational directive. He said Rhett had never personally arranged the removal of the diamond. He said the security director had acted on incomplete information and had exceeded his own authority. He said the diamond cutter had been hired for a separate project and had made assumptions about the material he was given. He said Saskia had planned and executed the entire scheme, using her access to Rhett's personal life to manipulate a man under extraordinary corporate pressure. Rhett sat very still and let his attorney say all of it. Hargrove watched him through the entire statement. Then he opened a folder in front of him. The next exhibit was an audio recording. It had been pulled from the hotel's internal security system, a line Rhett had used in the building on the night of the broadcast, a line that fed into the hotel's administrative recording protocol that every senior executive was notified about in writing when they took their position. A protocol Rhett had apparently forgotten about or had never seriously thought through. In the recording, Rhett's voice was clear and unhurried. He was speaking to the hotel's security director. He told the director to pull the Bellamy azure from the primary vault and replace it with the replica held in the secondary storage unit. He said the replica was to be certified as the original until further notice. He said this needed to happen before the evening's broadcast so that any inspection of the vault that night would find the correct documentation. When the recording ended, Hargrove looked at Rhett's attorney. The attorney said nothing. The investigator placed the next exhibit on the screen. It was a certification form, an official document, stating that the Bellamy azure remained intact and unaltered inside the primary preservation vault, dated the morning of the broadcast. The electronic signature at the bottom was Rhett's. He had signed a false certification attesting that the original diamond was in the vault. At the same time, he had already arranged for it to be removed. Rhett's attorney asked for a brief recess. Hargrove denied it. Elias Wren spoke for the first time since the hearing opened. He had been sitting at the far end of the table with a folder in front of him, quiet through all of it, and the room had largely stopped tracking him. That was intentional. Elias had been in enough hearings to know that the person who speaks last, when everyone else is exhausted and the room's defenses are down, is the person the room actually hears. He said he wanted to clarify one point about the agreement's provisions, because he believed there was a significant misunderstanding operating at the table. He opened the folder. Inside was the preservation covenant, the same document Mara had placed in front of Rhett weeks ago in the property manager's suite. The same document he had pushed back across the table while calling it a trap. Elias found the relevant section and read the key provision aloud. Then he said, "The removal and alteration of the Bellamy azure does not cancel the restructuring agreement." The room shifted. Rhett looked at him. "The $1.6 billion restructuring package remains intact," Elias said. "The hotels stay open. The employees keep their jobs." The agreement proceeds. What the covenant triggers specifically and exclusively is the automatic transfer of the Bellamy family's controlling voting rights. Those rights pass to the employee ownership trust. He closed the folder. The company survives, he said. The Bellamy family loses the ability to control it. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Rhett's attorney leaned toward him and said something quiet. Rhett did not respond to whatever it was. He was looking at the table in front of him with an expression that had moved past calculation into something that had no professional use. Hargrove called a short recess. During the recess, Elias went downstairs. He found Mara in the small office with Constance. He knocked once on the open door. Mara looked up. He told her what had happened in the room. The recording, the certification, Saskia's turn, the immunity request. He told her Rhett's attorney had run out of things to say after the recording played. Mara listened without interrupting. The provision, she said when he finished. Did it land the way it was written? Perfectly, he said. She nodded once and looked back at the window. The board convened an emergency session that afternoon. 6 of the 9 members were present in person. The other 3 joined remotely. The session lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Rhett's attorney made a final argument that the evidentiary hearings findings needed to be reviewed by outside counsel before the board took any action. The board voted 7-2 against waiting. Rhett was suspended as CEO effective immediately. His voting shares were frozen pending the investigation's formal outcome. 3 other Bellamy family members who had been copied on the false certification or had communicated with Rhett's assistant during the cover-up period were removed from their board positions and their financial interests flagged. The employee trust's designated representatives assumed temporary management authority over the hotel's operations. They had been briefed the previous evening in anticipation of exactly this outcome. They were not surprised by the call. They were ready. The $1.6 billion in authorization was cleared to proceed under the agreement's restructuring provision, with the employee trust now holding the voting rights that the Bellamy family had lost. The lenders, who had been watching the situation for 3 weeks with considerable anxiety, confirmed authorization by end of day. The hotels would remain open. Nobody who worked there would lose their job because of what Rhett had done. Rhett filed the emergency lawsuit that evening. His team had prepared it in parallel with the hearing, which told Elias everything he needed to know about Rhett's actual confidence in his defense. You don't draft an emergency filing in advance unless you already know the hearing is not going to go your way. The lawsuit accused Mara of designing the preservation covenant as a long-term mechanism to seize control of the Bellamy family's company. It alleged that she had leveraged her position as Dorothea Bellamy's chosen trustee to embed provisions that would transfer voting authority under circumstances she fully intended to engineer. It characterized her disclosure of the covenant and the timing of her vault inspection on the night of the broadcast as evidence of premeditation. The filing asked the court to issue a temporary pause on the voting rights transfer pending a full review of whether the covenant had been designed in bad faith. A judge issued the temporary pause at 8:47 that evening. It was not a ruling on the merits. It was standard practice when a party presented an emergency claim with arguable legal basis. Most courts paused the disputed action while they reviewed it. The pause was not victory. It was procedure, but it delayed the permanent transfer, and delay for Rhett was the only currency he had left. He called Mara at 10:30 that night. She answered because she had been expecting it. He did not open with a lawsuit. He opened with a question about the baby when she was due. Whether everything was medically on track, whether she needed anything. It was a particular tactic, and she recognized it. You establish that you are a reasonable person before you make an unreasonable demand. She let him finish the question. Then she said she was fine. I want to talk about what comes next, he said. Not legally, just us. There's no version of this that isn't legal at this point, she said. You took my company, Mara. She didn't answer that. Not because she had nothing to say, but because there was no productive direction it led. You took everything my family built, he said. You sat across from me in that room and offered me a way out, and when I said no, you burned it all down. You burned it down, she said. I documented what you did. Same result. Not the same, she said. Not even close. His voice changed. The measured quality dropped out of it. What was underneath was not grief. It wasn't even primarily anger. It was the specific voice of someone who had moved through disbelief and arrived at a place that felt, to him, like resolve. I'm going to destroy your reputation, he said. Every decision you made, every document you wrote, every conversation you had during that 18 months, I'm going to put it in front of a jury, and I'm going to make them understand what you actually did. And when the baby comes, I'm going to fight for that child every single day until I have custody, because I am not going to let you raise my daughter inside the story you're already writing about who I am. He paused. I'm going to get everything back, he said. All of it. She sat with the phone at her ear for a moment. "Good night, Rhett," she said. She ended the call. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, moving. Indifferent, generating noise that meant nothing in particular. She put her phone on the table beside her and pressed one hand flat against the side of her stomach, feeling her daughter shift and settle. There was a lawsuit now. A temporary pause. A judge who hadn't read the full record yet. More months of legal motion and counter-motion. More public statements. More of Rhett's team feeding narratives to journalists who would print them. She had known this was coming. None of it was a surprise. She had built the covenant to hold, but legal structures held because people fought for them, and fighting took time and energy, and a willingness to stay standing when the other side was throwing everything at you to make you fall. She was 36 weeks pregnant. She had not slept properly in a month, and the man she had once agreed to build a life with had just told her he was going to take her daughter. She sat with all of that for as long as she needed to. Then she picked up her phone and wrote a message to Constance. It said, "He filed tonight. Let's be ready to respond by Thursday." She set the phone down and went to find something to eat. The closed evidentiary hearing was held in the same midtown law firm as the first one. Same floor, different room, smaller, no display screen this time, just a table and documents, and the particular silence of a space where everyone present understood exactly what was at stake. Saskia's immunity request had been formally submitted 2 weeks earlier. Her attorney had framed it carefully: a woman who had been deceived by a powerful man, who now wanted to cooperate fully with the investigation, who was prepared to testify about Rhett's decisions in detail if the committee would agree to limit her personal exposure. The committee had taken the request under advisement. They had not yet responded to it. Saskia walked into the room and found Mara already seated across the table. This was not what she had expected. The hearings until now had kept them separated. Saskia had assumed that arrangement would continue, that Mara would remain a name in documents rather than a person in a chair directly across from her. She sat down. Her attorney sat beside her. She kept her expression neutral and her hands flat on the table. Hargrove opened the session by explaining that the committee was prepared to review Saskia's immunity request, but that they had questions requiring direct response before any determination could be made. He said Mara was present in her capacity as the reinstated preservation trustee, the suspension having been formally lifted 10 days earlier after the conflict of interest review found no evidence of bias. Saskia had known the suspension was lifted. She had not known Mara would be sitting across the table when the immunity decision was made. Hargrove asked Saskia to walk through her account of how she came to identify the Bellamy azure as the stone she wanted for her ring. Saskia gave the same answer she had given at the first hearing. She said Rhett had introduced the idea. She said she had expressed admiration for the diamond's history, and he had pursued it on his own initiative. Mara opened the folder in front of her. She placed 3 documents on the table and pushed them across without speaking first. She gave Saskia time to look at them. The first was a search record from Saskia's personal devices, a series of queries made 8 weeks before the broadcast. The queries pulled up the Bellamy Azure's insurance certification, the Preservation Trust's public filing with the state, and 2 legal articles about the consequences of removing assets from protected family trusts. The second document was a message thread between Saskia and a private jeweler in Connecticut, not the cutter Rhett had ultimately used, but a first attempt, someone Saskia had contacted on her own before she brought the idea to Rhett. She had described the diamond by name. She had asked whether a stone of its specific dimensions and cut could be reworked into a custom setting. The jeweler had declined to take the job. The third document was a series of messages between Saskia and Rhett, different from the ones introduced at the first hearing. These were from 6 weeks before the broadcast. In them, Saskia had grown impatient. Rhett had raised concerns about the trust documents twice, and both times Saskia had redirected him. She had written that the legal structure was his problem to solve, that he was the CEO, that if he wanted to prove he was serious about her, then he needed to stop hiding behind paperwork. Mara looked at Saskia. "You researched the trust before you raised the idea with him," she said. "You knew the diamond was protected property. You contacted a jeweler independently before he took any action. And when he hesitated, you pushed him forward." Saskia's attorney started to speak. Saskia put her hand up briefly, stopping him. She sat for a moment with the documents in front of her. Something in her expression shifted, not softening, not breaking. More like a person who has been maintaining a very specific posture for a very long time and has just decided to stop. Then she looked at Mara directly. "You couldn't keep him," she said. Her voice was controlled, but only just. "You hid behind contracts and legal provisions and institutional authority because you couldn't hold on to your own husband. That's what all this really is. You wrote a trap and waited for him to fall into it because that's all you had left." The room was quiet. Mara looked at her for a moment. She didn't rush her response. She didn't raise her voice or shift in her chair. "You did not take my place," she said. You helped him prove he was never worthy of standing beside me. Saskia held her gaze for a few seconds. Then she looked away. Hargrove cleared his throat and turned to the investigator. The investigator presented the final exhibit. It was a financial record flagged by the Employee Trust's auditors during the review of the hotel's accounts. 4 weeks before the Teterboro incident, a series of transfer requests had been initiated from two subsidiary Bellamy accounts Saskia had gained access to through RET. The transfers were routed through a layered structure that would have ultimately moved the funds into an offshore account registered to a holding company Saskia had established 18 months earlier. The transfers had failed. 2 of them had been flagged automatically by the bank's fraud detection system. The third had been manually reviewed and halted by a compliance officer who had noted the unusual routing structure. The total attempted was just under $4 million. Hargrove set down his pen. The immunity request was denied. Saskia was formally charged with conspiracy, attempted theft of trust property, obstruction of an official investigation, and witness intimidation for her attempts to have Pilar delete the video evidence. Her attorney immediately requested a continuance. Hargrove granted it for 48 hours. Saskia left the room without looking at Mara again. The ring was placed under formal legal seizure that afternoon. A preservation specialist was appointed to assess what could be recovered of the original diamond structure once the stone was removed from its setting. The setting itself, platinum, custom, expensive, was set aside as evidence. The Bellamy Azure, in whatever form it currently existed, was going back. RET's emergency lawsuit had slowed everything down, which was its purpose. The temporary pause on the voting rights transfer had held for 7 weeks, while the court reviewed the claim that Mara had designed the covenant in bad faith. During those 7 weeks, as the hotels operated under interim management by the Employee Trust's designated representatives, the lenders monitored the situation and sent weekly inquiries to Elias. The press filed stories about legal complexity and corporate uncertainty. Several of the hotel's senior staff gave anonymous quotes to business journalists about their anxiety over the resolution's timeline. Red had offered in the 3rd week of the pause to dismiss the case. He had 3 conditions. He wanted a seat on the restructured board. He wanted Mara to agree to seal the evidentiary record of his actions, not an expungement, just a confidentiality order limiting public access. He wanted the ability, post-resolution, to present himself publicly as an involved and present father after the baby was born. Mara refused all 3. She told Constance that settling those terms would mean protecting a man who had stolen trust property, filed a false certification, attempted to destroy evidence, and then launched a public campaign to blame his pregnant wife for the consequences of his own decisions. She said that sealing that record would leave the next CEO, the next board member, the next family member, with authority over protected assets without any public knowledge of what had already happened once. The record stays public, she said. That's not a negotiating position, it's the point. Constance filed the response. The final hearing on the lawsuit was scheduled for a Tuesday in February, 6 weeks after Mara's daughter was born. Mara was present. She sat at the plaintiff's table with Constance. She had not slept more than 6 hours at a stretch since the delivery, and she looked like it, and she did not particularly care. Rhett's attorney made his closing argument. He stood before the judge and said that Mara Bellamy had spent 18 months in a deteriorating marriage, aware that her husband was involved with another woman, aware that the marriage was approaching its end, and that during those same 18 months she had deliberately embedded a provision inside a complex legal agreement that she knew, given Rhett's established habits, he was extremely unlikely to read carefully. He said this was not preservation law. It was a legal ambush. He said Rhett had signed the agreement trusting that his legal team had reviewed it fully, that he had relied on professional advisors the way any senior executive reasonably relies on the people he has hired to manage details, and that a man should not lose his family's legacy because his wife wrote a trap she was certain he would walk into. He asked the court to void the covenant's voting rights provision on the grounds of bad faith. Elias requested a brief response. The judge nodded. Elias walked to the room's display and pulled up a video. It was from the original contract meeting the session, 14 months earlier, where the final version of the restructuring agreement had been presented for signature. The recording came from the meeting room's standard documentation system, a practice required under the lender group's due diligence protocols. Everyone present had known the session was being recorded. In the video, the room was full. Rhett sat at the head of the table. His legal team flanked him. Representatives of the lender group were on the opposite side. Elias was present as employee trust counsel. Mara sat 2 seats from Rhett. The video showed the moment when the preservation covenant section was reached. Mara turned toward Rhett directly. She placed her hand on the document in front of him. She said clearly and on the recording, "Rhett, I need you to read this section before you sign." The covenant language is specific and the consequences are significant. Please read it. Rhett looked at the page for approximately 4 seconds. Then he pushed the document toward his assistant. He said, "I pay people to worry about details." His assistant forwarded the document to his legal team's junior associate. The junior associate initialed it. 20 minutes later, Rhett signed the agreement. The courtroom was completely still. The judge looked at Rhett's attorney. The attorney was looking at the table. The ruling came 8 days later. The judge found that the preservation covenant had been disclosed properly, that Mara had made a direct and recorded request for Rhett's personal review, and that Rhett had knowingly delegated that review without consequence to the agreement's enforceability. The covenant was valid. The bad faith claim was without merit. The temporary pause was lifted. The voting rights transferred permanently to the employee trust. Rhett lost his position as CEO. His controlling shares were frozen as a condition of the ongoing fraud investigation and effectively removed from his functional control. The 3 personal properties he had pledged against company debt, a Manhattan apartment, a property in Connecticut, a stake in a private development, were absorbed into the resolution process. The evidence file was referred to the district attorney's office for review of potential criminal charges. The final divorce settlement meeting was held on a Wednesday morning in March. Mara's attorney's office, 8th floor, a room with good light and a long table. Rhett arrived alone. No attorney beside him, though he had one. She was in a separate room down the hall, available if needed. No assistant, no security. He wore a jacket and no tie, which was the first time in recent memory he had appeared somewhere significant without being precisely assembled. He sat down across from Mara. She had the settlement documents in front of her. They had been negotiated over 6 weeks through their respective legal teams. She had reviewed the final version twice the night before. There was nothing in it that surprised her. Rhett looked at the stack of papers for a moment. "Before we do this," he said. She looked at him. "I need to ask you something." She waited. "What I did," he said. "The way it looks publicly in the record, all of it. I'm not asking you to say it wasn't fraud. I know what it was." He paused. "But there were other things happening. Saskia had a way of making me feel like I was already losing before I made any decision. My family's been on me for years about the company, about being the one to fix what my father left in bad shape, about proving the name still meant something." He stopped. "I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking if you can let it be described as a business failure, a lapse in judgment, something that happened under pressure." Mara looked at him for a long moment. Then she opened the folder beside the settlement documents. She placed 4 pieces of paper on the table in front of him, one at a time. The order to remove the diamond from the vault, the false certification with his electronic signature, the formal complaint his team had filed accusing her of sabotage, the communication with the overseas buyer authorizing Saskia to proceed with the sale. 4 separate decisions, 4 separate moments where he had the option to stop and chose not to. "Saskia did not make these choices for you," she said. "You chose her, the lie and the company every time you were given a chance to tell the truth." He sat with that. He didn't argue. Whatever argument he had prepared, he seemed to have left it somewhere outside the building. "I'm asking about our daughter," he said quietly. "She's going to grow up and read about this. She's going to find the record. Can you think about what it does to her, having her father described this way? What she needs is honesty," Mara said, "and stability. Not a marriage kept in place to protect you from what you actually did." He looked down at the table. She picked up the pen. She signed the divorce agreement. Under its terms, Mara received full legal custody. Rhett was granted court-supervised visitation, subject to his completion of the required evaluations and his compliance with the ongoing financial investigations conditions. The arrangement would be reviewed in 18 months. There was no discussion after she signed. No attempt at resolution, no moment of shared acknowledgement. He did not reach for her hand. She did not offer anything to close the distance between them. She gathered the documents, put them in her bag, and stood. She walked out. She did not look back at him. 1 year later, Bellamy Grand Manhattan was busier than it had been in a decade. The restructuring had closed cleanly. The $1.6 billion had moved through its authorized channels. The debt was restructured on terms the hotels could actually sustain, and the employee trust management team had spent the 12 months since assuming authority making decisions that Rhett's team had deferred for years. Renovations, pay adjustments, a management training program that the old Bellamy board had considered unnecessary. The Bellamy name was still above the door. Mara did not become CEO. The trust had offered her a consultancy role, and she had considered it. In the end, she chose to lead the Preservation Trust itself and to expand its legal framework, drafting stronger safeguards that explicitly addressed gaps the Bellamy situation had exposed. Her work was quiet and detailed, and almost entirely invisible to the public, which was fine with her. The point of good preservation law was that nobody needed to talk about it, because nothing had gone wrong. Saskia was convicted on 2 counts, conspiracy and attempted theft of trust property, in a proceeding that took 4 months and generated considerable press coverage. Her luxury assets were liquidated as part of the sentence's financial penalties. The ring she had worn on live television as proof of something no longer existed. The setting had been dismantled, the chain of custody documented, the recut stone sent to a specialist in Antwerp, who spent 11 weeks working with the three-dimensional insurance scan to restore as much of the original structure as the recutting had left to recover. Rhett was living in a rental apartment in New Jersey. His name was still publicly connected to the fraud. No board would seat him. The executive community in New York was small enough that doors had closed without anyone needing to formally announce it. He was not in prison. The criminal investigation had concluded without charges sufficient for prosecution, a result that satisfied no one completely but reflected what the evidence ultimately supported. He had complied with the financial investigation's conditions. He was working through the supervised visitation process slowly. The Bellamy family had issued a statement 9 months after the resolution, distancing itself from Rhett's decisions and expressing support for the employee trust's leadership. Nobody with the Bellamy name currently held a board position. On a Thursday morning in April, Mara brought her daughter to the hotel museum. The baby was 7 months old. She was wearing a yellow jacket that Constance had sent as a gift and had strong opinions about being put down, so Mara carried her on her left arm through the lobby. The hotel museum occupied 2 rooms off the east corridor, a permanent installation of the building's history, its photographs, its original architectural drawings, its notable guests and significant moments. Dorothea Bellamy had endowed it 30 years earlier with the specific instruction that it should tell the real story of the property, not just the flattering version. The Bellamy Azure was in the back room. It sat in a new case, custom-built, climate-controlled, bolted to the floor at 4 points. The lighting above it was museum-grade, warm and directional, not the harsh light of a security vault. The stone had not been fully restored to its original form. The recutting had removed material that could not be replaced. But the authentication record had been updated to reflect its current state, and the internal asymmetry that made it identifiable was still present where the specialist had been able to preserve it. Mara stood in front of the case with her daughter on her arm. The baby looked at the light. Blue diamonds caught attention even at 7 months, apparently. Mara read the inscription on the case's base. She had been consulted on the language. She had not written it herself. The trust had convened a small committee, which had gone through 9 drafts before landing on something everyone agreed was right. It said, "A legacy survives only when no single person is allowed to place himself above it." Mara shifted her daughter to her other arm. She didn't talk about Rhett. She didn't talk about Saskia or the broadcast or the vault or the months that had followed. Her daughter was 7 months old and would not have understood any of it, and there would be time, years and years of time, to explain what had happened and why, in language appropriate to whatever age her daughter was when she needed to hear it. Right now, standing in front of a blue diamond in a museum that was open to the public, Mara just said, "Some things become stronger after people stop treating them as possessions." Her daughter grabbed a fistful of her jacket and held on. Mara turned and walked back through the museum, through the lobby, and out into the morning crowd on the sidewalk. The city moved around her the way it always did, continuous, indifferent, full of people going in every direction with their own weight to carry. Rhett had lost his wife, his company, his fortune and his standing, and the name that had once meant something specific in every room he walked into. Saskia had lost her freedom, her status. The ring she had believed was proof she had won. The divorce was final, the contract was fulfilled, the diamond had been returned. Every thread of the legal, romantic, and corporate collapse they had both set in motion had reached its permanent end. Mara walked into the crowd and kept going.